It is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our virtual training here on federal and state grants to reduce flood risk. We've got a great lineup of some folks with FEMA who will tell us about the federal grants related to flood damage reduction, and Kristy from Homeland Security Emergency Management Division of our Minnesota Department of Public Safety will talk about their role in helping you apply for FEMA grants. And Matt Bauman will be talking about the state's program for flood hazard mitigation, the grant program that's been around for quite a few years. We are recording this. We will in the future have a copy of the recording available on our training website. That does tend to take a little while to get there because of the accessibility steps we need to go through. Feel free to put questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat, and we should have time at the end for questions, and we'll have any time-sensitive questions we'll ask of the presenters as we're going along. And we'll have Andrew with FEMA start presenting. And Andrew, I can see your camera. And you're ready. Yep, it looks good. It's in presentation mode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Weeldreyer with FEMA Region 5, and I'm the Hazard Mitigation Officer for the state of Minnesota. And today I will be presenting with Sarah Stucky about the various hazard mitigation assistance grant programs at FEMA. So we'll start out with a general overview of the programs. So what is mitigation exactly? What you see written on the slide is the FEMA definition, but essentially mitigation is the long-term action that lessens the impact of a disaster the next time it happens. It means that the next time that it floods, your community won't be as impacted, and the next time there's a tornado, your community won't have as much damage. FEMA defines mitigation as any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to human life and property from a hazard event. The HMA grant programs provide an opportunity to apply for funding of a mitigation project. Obviously, mitigation is very important to us. On the screen, you can see several reasons why. It can help save lives, decrease property damage, reduce losses and disruptions to society, reduce legal liability, and protect critical infrastructure, and has a positive political ramification. Previously, studies had shown that for every $1 you spend on mitigation, you save $4. Those studies have recently been updated to show that for every $1 you spend on mitigation, you save $6. Those savings are refined even further based on the hazard type. For example, for every $1 you spend on riverine flood mitigation, you save $7 nationwide. Our team manages 3 major HMA grant programs that are active in Minnesota. They are the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, and the Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities Program. One of the best resources you can have to learn more about our programs is the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. This document gives an overview of all of our grant programs, including eligibility, how we review applications, and the eligible project types that we fund. Continuing in our overview of grant programs, there is some common terminology that I would like to go over. You may read and wonder what the difference between applicant or recipient is, or when the preface sub comes into play. The state is referred to as the applicant or pass-through entity when applying for grant funds, and they become the recipient once the grant has been awarded. Local governments are called the sub-applicant when applying through the state, and then becomes the sub-recipient when the grant becomes awarded to you. One thing to note, federally recognized tribes or territories may choose to apply for HMA grant funding as either directly as an applicant or through the state as a sub-applicant should they elect to. As you know, the state is the applicant for our HMA grant programs, but this visual shows who the eligible sub-applicants are for each grant program. States, tribes, and local governments are all eligible sub-applicants for the 3 active grant programs in Minnesota. The one thing to note is that private nonprofit organizations are eligible for HMGP only. There are a host of requirements depending on project type, but here's a list of what is always required for our projects. These are basic components involved in an initial review of the grant application. First, the mitigation measure must be a permanent or long-term solution. It must solve a problem independently, be cost-effective and environmentally sound, must be technically feasible from an engineering perspective, and it should be supported by the local community, including voluntary participation. And lastly, it needs to follow the state and local hazard mitigation plans. This slide is about the planning requirement for all hazard mitigation assistance programs. A proposed project should be identified in a local hazard mitigation plan, and the sub-applicant must have participated and adopted in that plan. For the hazard mitigation grant program, a FEMA-approved tribal or local hazard mitigation plan must be in effect at the time of award for project sub-applications. In the case of a BRIC FMA and FMA Swift Current, a FEMA-approved local mitigation plan must be in effect at the time of the application deadline and at the time of award for project sub-applicants. You can reach out to the state hazard mitigation officer if you're unsure about your community's planning status. Another thing to note, both the sub-applicant and the jurisdiction where the project is being taken place must meet this planning requirement. An example would be if Cook County is the sub-applicant and a project is located in the city of Chicago, both Cook County and Chicago need to have participated in and adopted the FEMA-approved local hazard mitigation plan. Some common project types we see in Minnesota are property acquisition and structure demolition, safe room construction, and community flood risk reduction projects. We also see 5% initiative projects, which are projects that are difficult to evaluate using FEMA-approved cost-effectiveness methodologies. Examples of these include warning sirens and generators. And another project type to mention are project scoping, which are activities that enable applicants and sub-applicants to develop mitigation strategies and obtain data to prioritize, select, and develop complete future project applications in a timely manner. Next, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, otherwise known as HMGP. HMGP is authorized under Section 404 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act, provides federal grants to states and local governments for cost-effective projects. And the key purpose of HMGP is to ensure that the opportunity to take critical mitigation measures is not lost during the reconstruction following a disaster. So HMGP becomes available when authorized under a presidential major disaster declaration, and it can be made available statewide or in specific areas of the state as requested by the governor. So how is the funding limit for HMGP established for each disaster, and how is it calculated? The HMGP ceiling for each disaster is calculated by looking at the total amount of assistance provided by the individual assistance and public assistance programs. FEMA provides individual assistance to eligible individuals and households who have sustained losses as a direct result of a disaster that receives a federal disaster declaration. Public assistance, otherwise known as PA, can fund the repair, restoration, reconstruction, replacement of eligible or public or certain nonprofit facilities or infrastructure damaged or destroyed by a disaster. Recipients with standard state hazard mitigation plans, such as Minnesota, obtain a 15% portion of the overall disaster assistance. So on this example on the screen, you can see that the total of individual assistance and public assistance funding was $10 million. So if this was a disaster, $1.5 million would be made available for the hazard mitigation grant program. This next slide gives an overview of the HMGP disaster timeline. The timeline starts at the date of the presidential disaster declaration, which is also the start of the application period. 30 days following the event, the first estimate of HMGP funding is issued. That estimate is refined at the 6-month period and then the 1-year period where the amount is locked in. The state has 1 year to submit applications for mitigation projects, but they have the option to extend the application deadline for up to 180 days. The period of performance for HMGP is 4 years, and this is the period to complete all grant-related work. After the period of performance, FEMA will work with the state to close out the disaster. Here on the screen is the list of recent Minnesota disasters. As you can see, the majority of declared disasters in Minnesota are of the public assistance type for infrastructure. The most recent disaster declared for Minnesota was disaster 4797, which was declared in June, and that was a public assistance and individual assistance disaster. One important aspect to mention is that our grant programs require a cost share element. While this cost share can fluctuate, it usually consists of a 75% federal share and a 25% non-federal share split. Contributions of cash, third-party, in-kind services, materials, or any combination thereof may be accepted as part of the non-federal cost share for a project. In addition to providing our contribution to the overall project costs, we also fund management costs. These are funds that are intended to fund the administrative costs relating to a grant. Subrecipients are eligible for up to 5% of the total project cost for subrecipient management costs. And keep in mind that management costs are provided outside of and are separate from the HMGP ceiling amount that we talked about earlier. And there are no additional cost share requirements for HMGP management costs. They are 100% federally funded. This last slide here for me shows the funding category limits for each project type. Up to 7% of the HMGP funding can be used for hazard mitigation planning projects, up to 5% for the 5% initiative projects that we talked about earlier, and building codes and standards, and up to 25% can go towards the advanced assistance projects or project scoping projects that we talked about earlier. The remaining funds are used for regular or construction HMGP projects. Also, any of the 7%, 5%, or 25% amounts not obligated into their categories can be reverted back into the regular HMGP project funds. And that concludes the section of my presentation, and I'll hand it off to Sarah Stucky to talk about the non-disaster grants that we have.
My name is Sarah Stucky, and I'm also with FEMA Region 5. I'm the Grants Management Specialist for Minnesota's non-disaster grant programs, which covers BRIC, FMA, and SWIFT Current within the state of Minnesota. So first I'll cover BRIC, which is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. So this is a newer program. It started in fiscal year 2020. And this fall, with the new release, we'll be starting our 5th grant cycle. So every year, with BRIC, there's an annual NOFO, or Notice of Funding release. Again, we're anticipating that it will be released, and the application period will open in October of 2024, with the closing period of February 2025. But please note, this is FEMA's application deadline. Minnesota may have an earlier deadline. And then moving on, as Andrew mentioned with HMGP, their period of performance is 4 years. With BRIC and FMA, our period of performance is 3 years. Another thing to note is cost share. The 75-25 cost shares are for typical projects. There are a few exceptions to receive a 90% federal cost share, 10% non-federal cost share, which is one is the economically disadvantaged rural communities, or EDRCs, and that's defined as a community of 3,000 or fewer individuals, and the community has an average annual income that does not exceed 80% of the national income. Another eligibility would be the Community Disaster Resilience Zones, or also known as CDRs. And this is based on the highest individual hazard risk rating in disadvantaged communities most at risk to natural hazards. This is something that is updated every 5 years, and it was just updated last year. So 4 more years to go for the next update. One thing to note is that tribes are not included in this as of right now, and FEMA will be releasing tribal CDR zones in the near future. So one way, or to explain how the BRIC funding is sourced, is that it's funded by a 6% set aside from federal post-disaster grant funding. So after each major disaster declaration, 6% of that funding amount goes into the BRIC program, which is why the funding availability, the funding amount is different from year to year. So these are the 6 guiding principles of BRIC. One thing to note, we really focus on innovation. And what does that mean? It can take a new approach to implementation or trying a new activity in your community that's never been done before. It could also be working with new partners in a new way. And something to note for innovation, it's going to look different for each community. Another guiding principle that we like to focus on are partnerships. We like to continue to work on building relationships both at the national and local level. And our bread and butter projects are really the large infrastructure projects. These are high dollar amount projects. Going through our guiding principles, you'll see that we want communities to consider changes to infrastructure that reduce damages caused by natural disasters, and not all projects need to be complex or expensive. Andrew mentioned the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide, but I really wanted to circle back to this guide for our BRIC eligibility activities. It also has FMA activities. And as he noted for HMGP, some of the project's requirements are that it must be cost effective, reduce and eliminate risk or damage from future natural disasters, meet the latest 2 consensus codes, which are the building codes. For BRIC specifically, you'll want to refer to that notice of funding opportunity for specifications on what 2 years you would be required. And then it also needs to align with the local or state hazard mitigation plan, as well as meet all environmental and historic preservation requirements. Some eligible activities for BRIC. The first one is our capability and capacity building, or sometimes known as CNCB activities. And under that, we have subcategories such as building code activities, partnerships, project scoping, mitigation planning, and planning related activities. So this could be where your community creates their hazard mitigation plan or updates their hazard mitigation plan. The next one is the project mitigation project. And again, this is really our bread and butter and our big projects such as acquisitions, safe rooms, infrastructure improvements, stormwater improvements. As Andrew mentioned, under BRIC as well, there's management costs, which is separate from the project, and it is 100% federally funded. The applicant can receive up to 10% management cost and the sub-applicant 5%. So again, same as within HMGP. And lastly, there's non-financial direct technical assistance. This is really for for communities that need to build capacity and capabilities and help them develop a high quality application or implement any new projects that reduce risk from a wide range of natural hazards. Something to note for the non-financial direct technical assistance is this is really for local communities. So the local community applies directly to FEMA. Moving on to the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, or the FMA. So actually today is the 30th anniversary of the FMA program, so it's kind of fitting, but I wanted to share that with you. So it has been around for quite a while, and it is a program that reduces or eliminates the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings insured under the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program, and within participating communities. All sub-applicants must be within good standing with the NFIP. And as with BRIC, this is an annual program, so the funding amount is determined each year through the Notice of Funding Opportunity. We are not sure when that, just as a side note, we're not sure when that one will be released, as the FY23 application announcements have not been made, hopefully in the next week or so, but just on a note that when that NOFO is going to be released is yet to be determined. Another thing with FMA, again, is the cost share. The typical project is 75 federal, 25% non-federal. There's a few exceptions. If there's severe repetitive loss structure, it can receive up to 100% federal funding. Or if there's repetitive loss or an NFIP property located in a socially vulnerable community, both of these could receive up to 90% federal cost share. So sub-applicants, again, must be participants in the NFIP policy and must be in good standing. And all structures must be insured under the NFIP in order to be eligible for these projects. Something to note for as far as insurance goes, for all elevation and mitigation reconstruction projects, those structures must maintain the NFIP policy for the life of the structure, regardless of the flood zone. And any acquisition demo projects, that NFIP policy must be maintained until the transfer of property, again, regardless of the flood zone. So moving on to Swift Current, which falls under the FMA program. This is a newer program that was launched in 2022, and the purpose is really to speed up funding after a flooding event and major disaster declaration. So Swift Current was made possible by the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, or the IIJA, and it is an annual congressional appropriation that's funded based on the National Flood Insurance Act and their amendments. Swift Current identifies and funds priority flood mitigation projects following a flood disaster declaration with sufficient NFIP claims. So again, as Andrew mentioned, the reason that Minnesota has an active Swift Current is an active Swift Current applicant is because of the disaster in June. Again, noting the same cost shares as with typical FMA projects. One thing to note specifically about Swift Current is that Swift Current does not fund properties that are not insured by NFIP. And once Swift Current is activated, all counties statewide are eligible, but please note that states have their priority, so please consult with them before applying. So these are the four pillars or goals of Swift Current. The first, again, is the speed of funding, really trying to focus on the simplicity of projects. Generally, again, these are acquisitions, mitigation, reconstruction. And it takes average of 12 months to receive the funding from application period closing to funding. So that's something that really Swift Current's goal is. Another is the equitable outcomes, and this kind of goes to the 90%, 10% cost share with the socially vulnerable communities. And then resiliency, and lastly, the NFIP, because again, at the end of the day, FMA and Swift Current are all tied to the NFIP, and properties must be insured. So private insurance properties are not eligible for Swift Current. For Minnesota, the 4797, due to that, Swift Current was activated. There's $10 million available in funding. The application period just opened a couple weeks ago. FEMA's deadline is December 30th, but please note that the state's deadline is December 13th. A few key changes for this fiscal year is that all applicants will now be required to go through FEMA Grants Outcome, or also known as FEMA Go. Previously, it was in eGrants, so moving forward, all grants will go through FEMA Go. There was project scoping was added as an eligible project type. One thing to note is this is up to a 1% set aside for applicants, and for any tribes and territories, it's up to 5%. Another thing to note are future activations, and applicants may be eligible for subsequent activation if they experience another qualifying event. So if you were to have another flooding related disaster declaration, you could be eligible for a second Swift Current amount. So again, talking about the project type eligibility, the project scoping was added this year. But mainly we focus on the individual flood mitigation projects. Again, thinking of acquisitions and reconstruction projects, mainly in Minnesota. And noting that all the buildings or structures that are eligible have to be FMA or NFIP defined severe repetitive loss, or any structures that are deemed substantially damaged. And here, this slide and the following slide have the definition of FMA's severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss.
Yes. I have a chat question.
Oh.
Can SWIFT funding be used for flood-proofing public buildings?
If they meet the requirements of, if they are NFIP insured, then yes.
I think that answers the question.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, got a thumbs up.
Thank you, Sia. So again, this is the definition. I'll mention that these slides will be made available, so you don't need to memorize these. You can take pictures, but again, these slides will be made available. So individual property flood project types. If you look on the left side, these are disaster impacted structures. So the bottom left, this home lost its second story and one of the exterior walls. The middle house is flooded and partially sits in a low-lying area. And then the far right, top right, house is completely engulfed in floodwaters. So then on the right is what you'll see as what post-disaster mitigation may look like. The first house was mitigated and it was elevated and improved. The middle house was elevated, and then the third house was completely acquired. So a couple projects for Swift Current from fiscal year 22, which was the first year. So this project was located in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in the city of Bay St. Louis. It was elevating 2 private NFIP insured structures. In general, an application can include a single property or multiple properties. And in this example, they did 2 separate sub-applications. Many of the communities have not completed FMA, flood mitigation assistance sub-applications, and lacked the capacity or capability to develop the application on their own. So FEMA does do support for Swift Current projects, We help support in the sub-application development for these particular projects. They helped conduct research for each property to identify the NFIP community information, assessment and property valuation data, property characteristics, and firm data, or the flood insurance rate map data. Most communities did not have a current list or database of their severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss property, and FEMA provided that information. FEMA also reviewed communities' sub-applications for completeness and made recommendations on how to improve their application. In the second example, this was in East Baton Rouge Parish, where the SWIFT current received a total activation amount of 40 million, and about 10% or 4.2 million went to elevating 22 severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties. And so far, with all 22 of these properties, all was awarded within 1 year of the application closing. And now most of these elevation projects are complete or near complete. So again, really reiterating, trying to be swift and getting the dollars out the door. So I wanted to get a little bit more into the weeds of the application development. I know Kristy will be talking more about the application in general later, but I just wanted to, for anyone on the call, just to go over a couple of best practices or some common pitfalls that we see in applications. So as best practice, make applications as detailed as possible. I know SWIFT current is usually a short window of application period, but trying to get as many details as possible to ensure that any sub-application attachments have file names that are clearly identified what is in each file. At a high level, FEMA needs a detailed scope of work, the project area and structure information, details on the existing condition of the project area, and then any potential impacts on people, environment, and cultural resources. And here's a list of some of the items that you would include in your scope of work, such as description and dimension of an area, staging area, concept plans, any maps of the project area. And then for visual documentation, providing GIS files will really help the environmental and historic preservation team review and streamline this process. One best practice for acquisition, elevation, and/or mitigation reconstruction projects is to clearly identify the flood risk. Use the best available documentation of flood data. This could be the effective FIS or the flood insurance study or advisory flood hazard information. In some cases, a recently completed H&H study would be considered best available data. It's also important to note that the flood hazard data should only come from one source for a structure. Next, also verifying the lowest floor elevation and the number of feet that the lowest floor elevation will be raised to correct. Again, if this is a elevation project. Be sure to use the correct building diagram type for the elevation certificate to determine the correct lowest floor elevation. Alternatively, you could include photos and documentation with a ruler, just something simple as that. And then some common pitfalls that we've seen in our application for acquisition projects. A common mistake is the lack of documentation for the fair market value of the building. The best form of supporting documentation for the fair market value is from a recent appraisal. If a recent appraisal is not available, other sources of estimating the purchase price are acceptable and should be supported with documentation. The building replacement value is the cost to build a new structure of the same quality, but is not representative of the fair market value. If an estimate other than the best data quality option was used, please include line items in the cost estimate for an appraisal to be conducted once the project is awarded. With elevations, I know Minnesota doesn't do this very often, so just, again, as mentioned earlier, lack of documentation. And then for mitigation reconstruction, some things to note is that the eligible costs for residential and non-residential structured are limited to $220,000 federal cost share per property. Another pitfall is having a structure size that's greater than 10% of the original structure size. The original square footage must be documented in the sub-application through copies of tax records and other verifiable means. Lastly, mitigation reconstruction is not allowed in a floodway or a coastal high hazard zone. And then here are some resources for Swift Current specifically in creating that application. Again, this document, these are all links, functioning links, and this document will be made available after.
Otherwise, let's get Kristy set up to talk about the partnership we have at the state level in administering those federal grants. And I'm seeing you on camera.
Yes, hello. I will get my presentation up. So I'm Kristy Dellwo, as Seal mentioned. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for Minnesota, based out of the HSEM office. And I'm going to be talking about the application process for all of the grants that Andrew and Sarah just talked about. So as mentioned already, we have the HMGP program, BRIC, and FEMA. So between these three, HMGP is what we consider a disaster grant, and then BRIC and FEMA are non-disaster. So the application period is relatively similar, but there are a few subtle differences. So on the HMGP side, we at the state will send out a notice of availability of funds to all of our local partners to let everyone know when we have funding available. And we select projects to apply based on state priorities. We do that through a notice of interest process. And it's approximately a 12 to 18 month application period. So a relatively long application period. And then all of our applications are completed in our HSEM recovery site. And typically we see a relatively quick application award period. So from the time of application to award is a few months normally. And then on the non-disaster side, the notice of availability of funds comes from FEMA, but we also will send it out to all of our partners. And this is based off of mainly federal priorities because it is a nationally competitive program for both BRIC and FEMA. But it's the same notice of interest process, but the application period is much shorter, typically about 4 months. And all of the applications are completed in the FEMA Go system. And then too, there's a longer waiting period for awards. Since it's nationally competitive, they go through a review panel. So it's typically 9-ish months from application to award. And so Sarah and Andrew kind of went over some of this, but just generally speaking, within our applications, there's a scope of work, you have a timeline, you highlight your budget, and then for construction projects, we have a benefit cost analysis that needs to be done. And then there are several different certifications for the grant you'll have to complete. And then once the project's awarded, there is quarterly reporting that's required as well. So just to give a little bit more information on the benefit cost analysis, for projects that require it, you do need a benefit cost ratio of 1.0 or higher to be eligible. And FEMA has a new streamlined BCA process. And this is for projects that are eligible for pre-calculated benefits. So that's any acquisition project with a structure under $360,000. Tornado safe rooms can be eligible for this too, and then hospital generators as well. The streamlined BCA is also available though for structures qualified as substantially damaged. So that's if the damage is at least 50% of the market value of that structure. Okay, so looking at our current funding opportunities for the HMGP program specifically, Andrew highlighted some of our recent disasters, and currently we have 2 application periods open right now. So disaster 4722 from the spring of last year. That application deadline is January 17th. We just have a little bit of funding left over, so we're not taking notice of interest for it anymore, but that is still open till January 17th. And then looking at the disaster from this past summer, 4797, we have a FEMA application deadline of June 28th, 2025. So that's 1 year from the disaster declaration date. We are currently taking notice of interest for this one through November 15th of this year. And looking at our approximate funding estimate right now is about $4.6 million is what we have to allocate there. And so I mentioned earlier we have priorities at the state level for HMGP. So we base it on 6 things approximately. So if your jurisdiction is in the disaster area in one of the declared counties, you'll get priority. If you have a critical facility or infrastructure in your project, if you've previously done an advanced assistance project through us, we like to fund those projects also. If we're doing an acquisition of repetitive loss properties, if you have a focus on climate change or equity, those are all things we like to fund under HMGP. Okay, so looking at the notice of interest process for HMGP, we accept them 2 ways. We would prefer the HSEM recovery site. So we have the link here. These slides will be available to you after. So what we have you do is register for an account in our site, and then you'll fill out the pre-application form. And we, after November 15th, we'll reach out to people to let you know if we're going to have you apply or not. And then you just complete that application in the same HSEM recovery site. The other way to submit a notice of interest is to email our general hazard mitigation email, and we can send you a fillable PDF form to submit the NOI also. And like I mentioned, our NOIs for the most recent disaster are due November 15th of this year. So moving on to BRIC and FMA, I have them joint on this slide because they come out at the same time. And as Sarah mentioned, we don't have BRIC and FMA for 2024 yet. The announcement hasn't come out yet, but we're hoping October. So in the next few weeks, we'll get that announcement. And then we'll come up with an NOI period, but I don't have that yet either. But the anticipated application deadline is going to be February. And our state deadline will be sometime in January of 2025. And then just in case you all are curious about what types of projects are selected under BRIC, I looked at the 2023 selections, and it was mainly, like Sarah said, large infrastructure projects. So utility and infrastructure protection, and then flood control. Those are like the top 2 project selections under BRIC. And then looking at FMA, I did 2022 because the 2023 ones haven't come out yet. But again, you can see a lot of elevation projects, not necessarily Minnesota, but that's one of the top project types. And then acquisitions are also really popular under the FMA program. And again, we have the same notice of interest process. So either through our recovery site or the email. And like I said, we don't have a deadline yet, but hopefully soon we'll have that out to everyone. And then lastly, looking at the Swift Current program. So we did receive funding for Swift Current this year that was awarded with Disaster 4797. So the FEMA deadline for applications is December 30th, but we're putting our state application deadline on December 13th of 2024. And we do have $10 million available in funds under Swift Current. And once again, not surprisingly, it's the same notice of interest process, but we don't have a deadline for Swift Current, so it is ongoing. So if you have any Swift Current projects, just reach out to us through either one of these means. And then lastly, this is not within HSEM, but Laura Milberg with MPCA asked me to plug their MPCA grant opportunity that they have at the state level. So they were allocated funds in the 2023 legislative session. They have $5 million for a local climate action grant program, which is exciting. So there's 3 grant types that they have available under this funding source: planning grants, implementation, and local climate action grants. And I'm not going to speak too much to this, but you'll have these slides. So the timeline of these grants, they currently have some of the implementation grants available for the wastewater resilience open right now. And then you can see all of these other ones are upcoming in this fall. So those will be coming soon. And if you want more information on that program, either Amanda Wold or Laura Milberg here would be happy to get you that info. So that is all I have. My contact info is on this slide, but I can take questions if there are any.
Hey, Kristy, I'll just note that Laura did put 100 million plus 5 million in the chat. And Laura, if you wanted to say anything about that, you should be able to come off mute.
Sure. The first slide had the 100 million, but it wasn't bolded. So I just wanted to make sure that people didn't think we were bothering you with $5 million worth of grants here. So.
Thanks, Laura.
Yep.
So thanks, Kristy. Let's move on to Matt to talk about the state-specific options there.
Wonderful. Okay, so my name is Matt Bauman. I am the program lead for the Flood Hazard Mitigation Grant Assistance Program. That's a state-run pass-through grant program. The grant uses funds appropriated by the legislature and funds projects sponsored by local government units. In this presentation, I'll give an overview of the program, a few updates, and highlight some of the projects that we funded. So like I said, it was established in 1987. It was written into statute 103F.161 to tackle the state's flooding concerns. And like I said, it's money entirely appropriated in a spending bill, which is usually a bonding bill or disaster bill. And it requires a 50% cost share, and that's from any non-state source. For, I guess, the last 15, 20 years, the legislature has been including rider language in the bonding bills that further limits the match requirement for cities, and that's based on a formula for median household income. But other than that, you're looking at a 1-to-1 match. We do like to leverage other funds as often as possible, whether it's FEMA funds, core funds, maybe there's a local foundation, watershed district, other local resources. Just to maximize the investment from the state. So FEMA, we learned a lot about FEMA programs today. Often fund 75% of a project, commonly through HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Now, if a community receives a grant, let's just assume hypothetically that it's like an HMGP grant that funds 75%, then the state might pick up the remaining half, 12.5%. FEMA funds have, they have limitations, so it's not always suitable for every project to partner, but this type of leveraging we found works especially well for buyout projects, buyout of flood structures at risk or structures that have been damaged that are just appropriate for buyouts. Since these are bond funds, there's limitations. They must be capital in nature, so some sort of improvement of the land, not studies or mapping, but structural works typically, or buyouts too. So before an application is submitted, applicants must have a good idea what their project is, some detailed analysis, cost estimates before an application is submitted. We know that acquisitions are FEMA's highest priority typically, and it's ours as well. It eliminates that risk and makes other opportunities available too. So the legislature has appropriated over $600 million since the program's been first funded, and that's not adjusted for inflation or anything. We've leveraged another $800 million in local and federal funds. You can see from this chart, funding was kind of modest until after the 1997 floods. And, it's for the most part correlated with when we've had our biggest flood events. Between about 97 and 2012, we had quite a few major flood events, and funding reflected that. So there's only a handful of states that have a true dedicated state-funded flood mitigation program. We've found that ours is a model, and it's a big reason why the state has experienced far fewer flood damages, at least lately, than the rest of the country. So this map shows all projects we funded, not just acquisitions, but projects. And it's a statewide program. We try to spread these funds around as best we can, to ensure they're distributed widely and equitably. But you can see the areas of the state that have taken best advantage of this program. And it's hard to get an idea scale when you look at this map. I'd like to update our spatial data set to highlight where our biggest projects are, because some of these projects might be as little as like $5,000, and our biggest investment is probably Moorhead, and that's almost approaching $100 million. So I think it's helpful to tell the story of all this program has accomplished. Early on in my tenure, and I'm still early, I've only been in this position since February, but I went back and looked at our list of projects we funded. And, I tallied all the communities that were some of our biggest beneficiaries. And, each of these communities identified here have received a significant amount of project funds. And, when flood risk is mitigated in a community, it opens these communities up to other investments that, residents and businesses would have been very reluctant to make. And we have rural projects too. And many watershed districts have implemented some very successful projects with this program. A number of watershed districts in the Red River Valley, reducing peak flows in the Red River Valley is very important to them, and we've been partnering with some excellent projects out there as well. Here's a screen grab of our website. There's 4 links that I want to highlight, and at least three of these, the bottom 3, I'm going to highlight a little bit more. Historical funding, this details all of our allocations, and then the remaining 3 links highlighted here I'm going to touch on a little bit more. This is our new grant prioritization document. We had some folks who wanted a better understanding of the DNR's funding criteria as a way to help guide their own planning and, scoping process. So we created this document that further, I guess, unpacks the 9 considerations that are detailed in statute. The legislature doesn't accommodate for any kind of scoring or cost benefit analysis. For the most part, it defers to DNR's judgment for award based on these 9 considerations in statute. So this document, it gets into all the other variables that might go into award decisions, and we think it's helpful for applicants as they scope their projects and get a sense of expectations for funding. This document highlights that our biggest consideration for award will always be potential risk to structures. So it's been a very successful program, and there's a ton of demand. That demand reflects it. And this is our unmet needs document, and we have other known flood concerns throughout the state beyond just this list, but these are the local governments that have a project in mind and they've submitted applications. There's 2 different colors. The ones in blue have been at least partially funded at this point. And this is another document that was updated by request from stakeholders. And we updated it most recently within the last 6 months by adding a column on the far right. And that column, it details what we're calling our preliminary priorities, and we wanted to be cautious about disclosing this because these are preliminary. And what's shown here, it doesn't guarantee an award. We might have some projects that are identified as high that might not receive an award if appropriations are low. And there's just a lot that goes into these funding decisions. We think it'll be beneficial to applicants and help them make their own plans, but it's not likely that we're going to be able to fund all these projects, truthfully. At least based on the recent appropriations that we've been seeing. But, these preliminary priorities help applicants, if they don't like the priority that we're showing, or perhaps they think their application is outdated or incomplete, they're always encouraged to amend it or change their scope in an attempt to assign it a better priority, or, maybe they see that they're a lower priority project and they'll just, pursue other funding alternatives. So we also updated our application form, and we wanted to make our funding decisions as objective as possible. So I wanted to update this form to tie more closely to the 9 statutory criteria. And, moving forward, I really want to ensure our awards are, tied to what's presented in the application. So for those on the call today, if you have a project in mind, by all means apply. It's helpful to get these applications submitted well ahead of the legislative session. We know legislators are looking at that list of unmet needs, and it helps guide our funding recommendations going into the legislative session. Few of the types of projects that we funded. Acquisitions of flood-prone structures is our highest priority. When the property is still in good shape and it can accommodate it, they're salvaged or relocated. But typically, by the time a homeowner wants to pursue a buyout project, it's usually in a post-disaster situation when the structures are deteriorated or demolished entirely. Since it's bond funds, often leveraging FEMA funds too, both FEMA and state bond funds require that the property is held in public ownership. Buyouts using FEMA funds versus state funds only. When federal funds are involved in a buyout, only open space uses are allowed. So you can't buy out a project with FEMA funds and then build a levee on that parcel. So that's a limitation of FEMA funds, and there's valid reasons for that. So when a buyout uses state funds only, that allows for other more creative development options. So we've, and I'll touch on this a little bit more in the next slide or two. So buyouts are very high touch projects. It requires a lot of cooperation from homeowners, and the local governments are usually the ones taking that on. And you have to find a homeowner that's willing to sell. And, you know, in a lot of cases, these are lower value homes, and they aren't getting enough to buy themselves a replacement, you know, or, I mean, today there's just an availability issue. There aren't any homes available. Interest rates are 6%. You know, nobody wants to leave a 3% mortgage to take on a 6% mortgage. So we do see acquisition opportunities coming up on short notice. We like to keep a very limited pool of funds when possible. You know, we don't always have it, but when we can keep a small pool, we like to for those buyouts that come up on short notice. Okay, this is a screen grab of Moorhead. This is a before on the left and an after on the right. There's not much change except for the left side of the this Riverside Road here. So you can see on the left side of the road, they've bought out all of these structures. And, you know, like I was mentioning, if Moorhead had used FEMA funds, you wouldn't have been able to build a levee in its place. So they used state funds to buy out all these structures and built a levee in its place. There was one holdout property owner that did not want to sell. I think they've sold since this time, and they were able to complete that levee project and get it certified. This here is East Grand Forks, and after their 1997 flood, they had 400 properties were acquired, and a levee was set back. So in this older picture, there is a levee in this picture, but it's very close to the water, you know, and when you aren't accommodating for the flood waters here, you know, velocity gets increased. You don't want a levee right next to the river if you don't need it right next to the river. You know, accommodating for storage is important. So in this case, a combination of different buyout projects was pursued to accommodate for a setback levee, a levee that was set back further away from the water. So in this case, the homes that followed the new levee, followed the new path of the levee, these were bought out using only state funds, whereas these homes that were in this location here, where a levee was not built, used a combination of HMGP and state funds. So we were able to leverage federal funds in this location where the levee wasn't. So that's just kind of a creative approach that seeks to maximize those federal funds whenever possible. Austin is a wonderful success story. They've kind of done like a multi-prong approach: buyouts, levies. They have a community foundation that has provided local share, and voters there approved a half-cent sales tax that goes towards flood mitigation. And I believe that was recently renewed by voters to finish their projects. And the finish line is in near sight with Austin right now. There's been big investments in Austin. We have a joint Minnesota and Iowa MNAFPN, Minnesota Association of Floodplain Managers Conference, is down in Austin this year. So we got a tour where we can see some of Austin's great work down there, and they have a very proactive watershed district where they're still pursuing smaller storage projects upstream of Austin. So, you know, the work isn't done, and they're a very resilient community where they absolutely were not earlier. This is Montevideo. This is the CORE project that we partnered with the CORE on. So this is a combination of CORE money and state FHM money. And this was a combination of acquisitions and development of a levee. So started in 2012. We actually just closed this project just 2 weeks ago. This is one of the many impoundments that's been funded with flood hazard mitigation dollars. This one here is a 2,600 acre impoundment. It drains 32 square miles. This is massive, and you can hold a ton of water with these types of projects. And it reduces impacts to ag land, downstream communities. It reduces peak flows, and it's not just storage, but it's water quality too. You're providing tons of habitat for migratory birds and local birds and other wildlife as well. It stabilizes that stream. They've just been very popular projects in the Red River Valley. This is the city of Pearlie. This is a project that's going on right now. This is a levee project. I think 2 of the 4 sides of this community was a certifiable levee, and then the newest portion of this project raises these roads. And once these roads are raised, it will be it'll get this entire community out of the 100-year floodplain. Ring dikes. We've funded over 270 ring dikes throughout the Red River Valley. These were built with a 1-to-1 match. These are businesses. Each one of these farmsteads is a small business, and the farmland in the Red River Valley is some of the most fertile farmland in the Midwest. And these ring dikes have protected the long-term investments of these business owners. So since these are privately owned, these were not funded with bond funds. These were funded with general fund money, and which is not appropriated very frequently, but they were funded very aggressively for a period of time. And during that period of time, for the most part, everybody that wanted one and was willing to pay for one got a ring dike. So like anything, this program has its challenges. It's a very good deal. So there's a high level of interest, but appropriations are completely at the mercy of the legislature, and they're quite variable. So, flood amnesia, funding largely correlates with when we've had big disasters. It's fresh in legislators' mind. The general public favors funding the program when we've had flood damages. So during periods of time where we haven't had any major floods, program support kind of wanes. Aging flood infrastructure. So, a lot of infrastructure has been built a long time ago. It might be New Deal era and approaching or well beyond its useful life. And a lot of that infrastructure needs to be replaced. We've been seeing an increased demand for even just general stormwater projects. Climate change, we're getting more water. And then there's just a waning commitment from the legislature. We're getting questions, when does it end? A lot of our most at-risk communities have been mitigated through this program. But there's still demand, and I'm confident that there always will be demand. So you just need to look at the unmet needs list and sit in on a couple of the conversations that I've been having on a constant basis with communities very concerned about the risk that they still have. So that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to field any questions.
Well, Matt, this is Gary. I guess I've got a quick question, and I'm not sure it makes much sense for these types of projects, but you mentioned for the flood hazard mitigation grants, it's like a 1-to-1 50% match or local match. Can communities get creative and look at in-kind matches, whether that's staff or providing equipment for the project, or is that just not an option?
In-kind does not satisfy the local match requirements for this program. It needs to be true
monetary.
monetary funds
Okay.
appropriated by the local government.
Okay, thank you.
But that would include like taxes collected, like that sales tax and some of the other kinds of sources, right?
Absolutely, yeah. MMB needs to pre-approve the match that's committed by the local government. So, you know, when a community gets a grant, before the state's willing to release money to DNR, we need to show the commitment that the community has made, the monetary commitment, and it needs to satisfy state requirements. And that's all detailed by the legislature in statute. So MMB has requirements that are laid out in statute of what types of funding commitments work and what doesn't.
Well, thanks to all of our presenters today. Thanks, Matt, and our friends from FEMA and Kristy, who had to leave for another meeting. As we mentioned earlier, we will share PDFs of the slides. Should be able to get that out in the next couple days here. And we will be putting a recording up on our website. It may take a month or two to get that posted due to the way that our process works. But appreciate those who were able to attend today. And I don't see any outstanding questions, so we'll say we'll give everybody back about, looks like 13 minutes. We don't need the whole hour and a half, and appreciate everybody coming.